The Russian title Tsar was the Slavic form of Caesar. This was not inappropriate, given that most of the leading members of the House of Romanov, as did many of the rulers of ancient Rome, suffered from gross personality disorders, and many more were mentally unbalanced. Even some of the key female Romanovs were degenerate megalomaniacs who used their power to give free rein to their fantastical whims and took pleasure in humiliating the defenseless people around them. Considered the most heroic of all the Romanovs, Peter the Great was huge both in stature and accomplishment. He was regarded by his contemporaries as the most talented man of his age, and he's often described as Russia's first modern man. His sweeping policies and the mental state that helped to create them shaped Russia's destiny. He applied his incredible energy to reforming his government and state and turning it into a leading European power, but for much of his reign he was evidently mentally unbalanced. His name was a byword for enlightenment, but the methods he chose to educate his fellow Russians would have made Stalin queasy. Some of his more brutal behavior was that of a violent drunk, and the Tsar was drunk for most of the time. In fact, he only ever rested when he had a hangover. But Peter didn't need alcohol to be vicious. Like so many leading members of his royal house, he was a paranoid sadist. His father, Alexis Mikhailovich, was the second Russian ruler from the House of Romanov. Regarded as one of the more laid-back and tolerant czars, Alexis once had 7,000 people tortured and executed after a popular uprising. The young Peter, his 14th illegitimate child, was unlike any of the Tsar's other offspring, because he was healthy and strong, and stood out in a nursery full of congenitally ugly and malformed Romanov children. Before Alexis died, he proclaimed his eldest living son, Theodore, as his successor, but the puny heir died aged 20. Peter's real father was probably a close friend of Tsar Alexis. Many years later, Peter confronted the man he suspected of being his true father, and offered to strangle him if he didn't own up to sleeping with his mother. "I don't know what to say to you," the terrified man stammered, "except I was not the only one." Tsar Peter had amazing physical strength and stamina, although his chronic alcoholism had a disastrous effect upon both his personality and his health. According to most contemporary reports, he was a giant, probably 6 feet 5 inches tall, and could bend coins by twisting them in his fingers. He was swarthy and sunburned, cared little for his appearance, was generally unwashed, and wore filthy clothes. On the Tsar's visit to Prussia in 1717, he and his verminous entourage were described by a German baron as like baptized bears. They offended their hosts with an open display of bad behavior, including the virtual destruction of a palace at Montbijou, which had been provided for him by the Prussian royal family. In Hanover, he dined with King George I's mother, the Electress Sophia, a flabby, toothless crone who had replaced all her missing teeth with squares of wax. She was repelled by his disgusting table habits, but found redeeming qualities under the layer of imperial dirt. She noted the fact that he has not been taught to eat in a tidy manner is obvious, but she was much taken with his natural and easy manner. The Electress also commented on Peter's ignorance of whalebone corsets. The Tsar was confused by what he believed to be German women's damnably hard ribs. In London, Peter met King William III and was put up briefly in a house in Buckingham Street. But when the king walked into the room, he was overcome by the stench that accompanied Peter and a couple of servants. When the Tsar left, he presented King William III with a huge uncut diamond wrapped in a scrap of dirty paper. When the Tsar had had enough of London, he and his friends moved to Deptford and lodged at the home of Sir John Evelyn. They tore up paintings and furnishings, smeared vomit and excrement on the floors and walls, smashed expensive parquet floors, and used paintings as target practice with their guns. Sir John later presented the British government with a bill for £350 for damage to his property. The Tsar was given to unprovoked bouts of violence, and would often thrash his own courtiers with a cudgel for fun. These beatings became such a regular part of court routine that to take a thrashing from the Tsar was looked upon as a mark of favor. He once had a peasant tortured because the poor man was unaware that the Tsar now also bore the title Emperor, although the title was not generally acknowledged in his lifetime. He took pleasure in personally beheading dissidents with his axe, and the road to the Kremlin was regularly strewn with the decapitated corpses of Peter's victims, left to rot in the snow for months. The heads were placed on spikes and became food for crows. In the Tsar's most violent drunken binges, he suffered from alcohol-induced hallucinations and paranoia. He convinced himself that the whole of Russia was populated with traitors, and used the slightest suspicion as an excuse for a witch hunt. Shortly before he set out on the first of his famous missions to Western Europe, Peter's spies informed him of a plot against his life. He had the ringleaders arrested and tortured. To make sure the Russian people behaved themselves while he was away, he arranged a little exhibition to concentrate their hearts and minds. The Tsar disinterred the remains of a famous dissident, Ivan Miloslavsky, who had been executed 12 years earlier. Miloslavsky's decomposed corpse was dragged by pigs to the place of execution, hacked into small segments, and placed underneath the scaffold in an open coffin. On the platform above, the plot ringleaders were slowly dismembered so that their fresh blood dripped down onto the remains of the late Miloslavsky. The severed body parts were neatly arranged, and their heads fixed on spikes. The Tsar left orders that no one was to remove this grisly display, which lay putrefying until his return. In 1713, Peter declared that St. Petersburg was now the new capital of Russia. In order to populate it, he simply emptied Moscow of thousands of families and forced them to move to St. Petersburg on pain of death. Between 100,000 and 200,000 people died in the process. The city itself was built on the corpses of hundreds of thousands of Russians. In the merciless extremes of the Russian winter, he forced laborers to work without proper tools, often waist-deep in water. Although conditions were impossible, discipline was shockingly severe. The Tsar ran around the building sites, personally beating workers with his cudgel. Any man caught slacking had his nostrils flayed. He killed more people in the name of civic planning than he did by his almost continuous warfare. The Tsar mixed vodka, wine, beer, and mead and swilled them simultaneously. When he traveled to Western Europe in 1697, he was more often than not dead drunk. In a day and a half at Antwerp, he and a handful of friends consumed 269 bottles of wine. His trip to France in 1717 was considered by Parisians to be the best free freak show they had ever seen. The visit cost France £150 a day to keep him. One itemized bill was for the women called in to undress and clean up the Tsar when he got drunk at a reception and urinated in his pants on the way home. He created a drinking club, the vastly extravagant, supremely absurd, omni-intoxicated synod of fools and jesters. The name is a dig at the more reactionary features of the Russian Church, but was mainly an excuse for orgiastic drinking sessions which lasted for days on end. At the head of this company was his former tutor, an elderly and senile dipsomaniac named Nikita Zotov. At these quasi-ceremonial binges, Peter poured vodka down the throats of his cronies with a funnel, while Zotov, seated on a high ceremonial chair, was sick on the heads down below. The Tsar liked to get other people drunk and watch them make fools of themselves while showing off his own legendary ability to drink. He would force everyone who dined with him to drink from bucketfuls of vodka, and anyone who tried to duck out was forced to drink even more. It was a prospect that terrorized many of his guests, but the Tsar had sentries posted at the doors of the banquet hall to stop them from leaving until he had been entertained. Peter the Great was a keen amateur surgeon and anatomist, but his morbid fascination for the macabre far exceeded his interest in medical science. During a trip to Holland, just after a heavy meal, the Tsar watched with fascination the anatomical dissection of a human cadaver. When two of his nauseous attendants made it clear that they didn't share his enthusiasm for human intestines, Peter forced them to bite into the flesh of the corpse. Although the Tsar was an incompetent surgeon, no one ever dared to disappoint him when he volunteered to wield the knife. When the Tsarina Martha Apraxina, widow of his half-brother Theodore III, died, Peter personally opened up her corpse to find out if the rumor that she was still a virgin at the age of 49 was true. He once removed 20 pounds of water from the dropsical wife of a rich Russian merchant named Borst. The Tsar was extremely proud of his handiwork, but was furious when the woman selfishly died shortly afterwards. He ordered an autopsy to prove that he hadn't been responsible for the death. Naturally, the inquest found that the Tsar was entirely blameless. Peter once saw a bad tooth being pulled, and was suddenly consumed with ambition to turn his hand to amateur dentistry. Overnight, the Tsar's retinue of 250 courtiers became unwilling accomplices to his new hobby. He carried out spot dental checks on anyone who happened to be passing. If any tooth looked suspect, he whipped it out. Unfortunately, as he was quite unaware of his own strength and sometimes got carried away, he accidentally removed gums also. Peter kept the teeth he'd drawn from his courtiers in a little bag. One day, a courtier appealed to him for help. His wife had a terrible toothache, he said, but she was so scared of having a tooth pulled, she would pretend nothing was wrong whenever a dentist approached her. The Tsar obliged, and ignoring the screams and protests of the woman, pulled the tooth and popped it in his bag. Only later did it emerge that the woman had never had a toothache in the first place. Her husband just wanted to teach her a lesson. Peter built a museum of curiosities to satisfy his fascination with freaks of nature. His collection included a man without genitals, a child with 2 heads, a 5-footed sheep, a deformed fetus, the organs of a hermaphrodite, the hands of a man who died by excessive drinking, with all its blood stagnated in the veins, and the corpses of Siamese twins. Each specimen was individually pickled in an alcohol-filled jar. The museum caretaker, a badly deformed dwarf, could look forward to the day when he too would be pickled. One of Peter's prize exhibits was a pickled phallus, donated by the Prussian king Frederick William. This item had caught the Tsar's eye on his trip to Berlin, and the Prussian king was only too delighted to get rid of it. Peter thought it would be a good jape to persuade his wife, Catherine, to kiss it. She accepted his invitation, but only after he made his offer more attractive by offering to cut off her head if she declined. The sight of blood whetted Peter the Great's appetite. The Tsar would torture people with his own hands, and then immediately sit down to enjoy a hearty meal. He loved watching torture sessions, and would shout and cheer and urge the torturer on. He was even capable of knouting his own son to death without any sign of remorse. The Tsar had become increasingly paranoid until he became convinced that even his heir Alexis was a traitor. The Tsarevich had inherited none of his father's talents or ambitions, and turned out to be a feeble, shiftless youth who lived in dread fear of his drunken, erratic father. When Alexis was once asked to draw up some simple plans, he shot himself in the hand rather than expose himself to his father's criticism. When it was time to find a bride for Alexis, the fiancée chosen for him was Charlotte of Brunswick, a skinny 16-year-old with a smallpox-raddled complexion. Alexis disliked the idea of marriage in general, and his new wife in particular. Shortly after his wife gave birth, he moved his new mistress, a Finnish floor scrubber named Euphrazina, into their home. When Alexis discovered that his wife was pregnant a second time, he kicked her in the stomach. Charlotte, just 21 years old, survived the beating just long enough to give him a son, Peter. The Tsar ordered an autopsy on his daughter-in-law and attended it in person, studying her in detail. Charlotte was quickly forgotten, and Alexis resumed relations with his mistress. In 1718, Peter gave his feckless son an ultimatum: "Mend your ways, or you will be disinherited." The Tsarevich took fright and fled abroad. Peter interpreted his son's flight into the custody of a foreign power as an act of treason, and he had Alexis arrested and tortured. Peter supervised the torture and even joined in. Long after the inevitable confession, the racking and knouting continued until Alexis, fatally weakened by the time-honored practice of bloodletting, finally expired. By his early 30s, the ravages of alcoholism and gluttony had rendered the Tsar a physical wreck. The nervous tic he suffered in his youth had developed into a violent spasm which convulsed his whole face, and he began to suffer from epileptic fits and blackouts. In the final years of his life, his early 50s, he refused to retire to bed alone in case he had a seizure and died in his sleep. If a woman wasn't available, a male servant would do. The Tsar's doctors begged him to take spa waters to repair some of the damage done to his body. He drank the water, but always topped it up with alcohol to improve the flavor. Tsar Peter the Great was one of history's all-time heavyweight royal adulterers. The Tsar took pride in the fact that he was the father of countless bastards. He considered it part of his patriotic duty. Whenever the Tsar wanted sex, his wife's ladies-in-waiting were his mainstay for instant gratification. When Peter and his wife visited Prussia in September 1717, they had in tow about 400 ladies-in-waiting who acted as cooks, chambermaids, and washerwomen for the party. A German princess noted that about 1 in every 4 women was carrying a very well-dressed child. When pressed about the whereabouts of the fathers, each replied with a smile, "The Tsar did me the honor." Foreign ambassadors would pretend not to notice while Peter openly fondled the breasts of his wife's ladies-in-waiting. The Prussian King Frederick William I witnessed Peter greeting his niece, the Duchess of Mecklenburg. The Tsar swept her up in his arms, carried her to an adjacent room, tore off her underclothes, and had sex with her right there on the spot, not even bothering to shut the door to prevent her husband from watching. Both of the Tsar's wives were aware that he regularly took prostitutes as well. Unabashed, he boasted that he spent less money on his mistresses than any other monarch in Europe. When he visited France, the thing he looked forward to more than anything else was the promise of the Parisian brothels. At Versailles, it was recorded that he slept with a streetwalker, upset her with his legendary stinginess, then sent her packing. Husbands sensibly learned to turn a blind eye when it became apparent that their wives had taken the Tsar's fancy. One of Peter's mistresses was married to an army captain named Chernychov. She gave birth to 7 children, and no one was quite sure, not even their mother, which were the husbands and which were the Tsar's. When she gave Peter syphilis, however, the Tsar was furious and instructed the husband to give her a sound whipping. The Tsar had a long-serving mistress named Mary Hamilton, a Russian-born girl descended from a Scottish family. When Peter became bored with her, she consoled herself by sleeping with several of Peter's aides. She found herself with a series of unwanted pregnancies, which she resolved by systematic infanticide. One of Mary's lovers was a courtier named Orlov, who bullied her and demanded money from her. To keep Orlov happy, she pilfered from the Tsarina's jewelry collection. Mary's access to the jewels made her the prime suspect, and when she was questioned by the Tsar, she quickly broke down and confessed all, including the murder of the newborn babies. Peter was incensed, not because she had slain innocent children, but because it was just possible that one of them might have been his, and Mary Hamilton was duly sentenced to death. The Tsar was present at her execution. He kissed her, then watched as her head was cut off by the executioner. He picked up the bloodied head, pointed out to the crowd below how expertly the axeman had severed her neck, kissed her full on the lips, dropped the head in the mud, and then walked away for a beer. The Tsar demanded fidelity from his wives. His second wife, the Tsarina Catherine, had an affair with her husband's chamberlain, William Mons. She was indiscreet, and everyone at court got to know about it except the Tsar. When word of the affair finally reached him, he was both furious and sorely embarrassed. His ego would not allow him to admit that his wife had preferred to sleep with another man, and so he could not bring himself to confront her. Without any reference to the alleged adultery, Peter had his chamberlain arrested and condemned on trumped-up bribery charges. Catherine watched as Mons was beheaded, but her nerve held, and she was very careful not to show the slightest sign of emotion that might betray her. The Tsar was exasperated by his wife's display of inscrutability. One evening, Catherine returned to her room to find her ex-lover's head pickled in alcohol in a jar by her bed. She retired to bed without flinching. Night after night, Catherine went to sleep beside her grisly bedside ornament, but still she kept her composure. Finally, Peter gave up and had the head removed. Half a century later, when Catherine the Great was reorganizing Russia's Museum of Fine Art, she found 2 jars containing the pickled heads of Mary Hamilton and William Mons. which had been on display in the gallery since 1724. Anyone of a variety of health problems could have explained the Tsar's final slide into mental derangement. It was preceded by an unexplained and severe illness, possibly encephalitis. His convulsive fits could easily have been delirium tremens or the effect of tertiary syphilis, which can lead to dementia or rapid decay of physical and mental ability. His death from cirrhosis of the liver in 1725 was an inevitable consequence of prolonged alcohol abuse.